So hello everyone, welcome. My name's Andrew Jack. I'm the education editor at the Financial Times and very engaged and interested in what's happening in schools around the world, as well as ways in which we can encourage this coming generation to still engage with news and develop critical thinking and so on. But of course, one trend that we're seeing in so many countries is the question of distraction, attention, the drivers and concerns around social media and what that's doing to the mental health, well-being, and the learning outcomes, and even school attendance for this coming generation. Common trends, all sorts of different responses and reactions. And over the next hour or so, we're going to explore this with a great panel. We encourage you not during the hour to be using your own phones, but at the end, there will actually be a QR code where you can snap to actually get a recording of the event and some further resources for afterwards, as well as CPD credit. So we're going to have a discussion with our experts here on the panel, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. So we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. We should have about 20 minutes or so for that in the latter half of this hour. So we can move to the next slide, please. And just a reminder, obviously, here, as you all well know, this huge explosion in mobile phone and other technology use, and what that's leading to in terms of both doom scrolling, in terms of mental health and social well-being, in terms of attention and distraction, whether in life, in social playgrounds, in situations outside the classroom, but also very much in terms of the core classroom experience. And there's lots of sort of debate and discussions, of course, about the different figures, but we all know how much there can be risks of time delays, of concentration, of the problems, as we were discussing earlier, of trying to multitask and perhaps failing as a result to do anything really well as a result. And of course, phones have made that level of distraction so possible. Next slide, please. And so, meet our experts. So we're going to talk to Meisha Porter here on the left, deeply involved in the New York City school system, amongst others, now working on education innovation. Graham Dugoni, the founder of Yondr, and Catherine Price, the author of this great book, How to Break Up with Your Phone. And we can go in a little bit into some structured questions, but let me first ask each of you briefly to say a little bit how and in what way you became focused on this issue of phones and the distraction that they can cause. Meisha.
You know, I spent over 20 years in education in New York City, 11 of those years as a principal of a 6 through 12 school, and spent way too much time trying to get young people to put their phones away. When we went into the pandemic and kids had to be on devices all day, when we came back, I just was keenly aware that young people needed to be disconnected to reconnect to school. And so that's kind of my entry point into this conversation. It is, you know, all of us who worked at the school building level or the system level were thinking about how do we get young people reconnected and re-engaged in education. And it started with getting them disconnected from the devices they had been so deeply connected to through the pandemic. And frankly, they were ready for that. Right? Part of why young people wanted to come back to school is to reconnect to learning, reconnect to their amazing teachers and leaders, and reconnect to each other. And so that's my entry point into this conversation.
And Greg, what about for you?
Yeah, so I started Yondr in 2014. And back then, the conversation around distractions and the role of technology in education was radically different. So I was going into schools and going to venues every day and talking about phone-free spaces, and people would look at me like I had 3 hours. But I started the conversation, and I started the company in San Francisco, and at the time it was in the center of this tech boom. And I think the dominant idea that there would be this kind of tech utopian future where everything would be more connected everywhere all the time, and that was going to lead us to this great place, I just had a lot of misgivings about it. I thought that, especially for digital natives, growing up in the world, having a smartphone in your pocket was going to be a radically different experience. And as a crossover generation, I thought it was our responsibility to lay down some framework or some experience of what it's like to just be a kid and walk through the world without your experience being mediated by screens and all the things that it affects. So that was my entry point, and started evangelizing, and work over the years directly with schools and with artists has just kind of grown and built the program and the company into what it is now.
And Catherine, so you've written the book on this. How did it all come about?
Literally.
Literally, right, yes, I wrote How to Break Up With Your Phone, but I would never have thought that I would have written this book or would be on this panel based on my background. I actually started my career as a teacher for middle school boys, an all-boys school in Manhattan, which was intense. I'm sure all of you have imagined what that was like. And thankfully at a time when there were no phones in schools. And then I actually had a career as a health and science journalist, and I was doing a lot more about nutrition and health and wellness. I have type 1 diabetes, so I was kind of doing physiology, things like that. But then I had my own daughter in 2015. And I had these moments when I was up with her late at night, and I just had these kind of out-of-body experiences where I saw what it would look like to an outsider, and it was her looking up at me and me looking at my phone. And it really upset me. I wasn't ever into social media. I was looking at stupid things on eBay, but it was still dumb, and I just didn't want that to be what she experienced as a relationship with her mom, and it wasn't how I wanted to be living. So I decided to turn that into a professional project, and that's how to Break Up With Your Phone first came to be. And that really has helped adults reframe their relationships with technology. But I've also heard from kids like 13 on up, I would say, that the book has really helped them. And I was honestly scared to think about what to do for kids younger than that. It just seems so intimidating. But I've recently turned my attention to that as well because of my own daughter, and gotten really involved in advocacy work. Jonathan Haidt's team, the Anxious Generation, all of that. And I'm just thrilled to be here to talk about it. I think that having a phone-free school is a right that every kid should have, and I'm excited to be around people who support that.
Yeah, and I guess, Meisha, in your experience over the years as an educator, I mean, there is this kind of perfect storm, right? I mean, we had, in the past decade, widely available devices, affordable, pretty much universal, the explosion of social media, and then, as you say, COVID pushing people often into isolation. I mean, can you think of any previous sort of disruption, perhaps, on that scale that educators have had to face going back?
Not in my young lifetime. I just want you all to know how young I am before I start answering the question. But no, I mean, I think we have, educators stand up to a lot of, issues in the communities that we serve in different ways. But there's never been like the perfect storm of crisis, frankly, at one time to happen to close and shut down schools across the world, right? Like not just in one city or one country, but across the world. And it put us in a position, and I will say, unfortunately, a position that I don't think we took advantage of, to really rethink schooling and to really rethink the opportunities that we wanted to create around learning. And I think now, post-pandemic, I've heard so many people say, like, let's get back to normal. Well, I don't want us to get back to normal, because normal wasn't good for so many students across the country and across the world. I want us to create a new normal. And part of that new normal is recentering what learning looks and feels like for students, with them disconnected from things and reconnecting to each other. And so I think we still have the opportunity, right? We are still in a place where, blessings to all of the people who are working in school buildings right now as teachers and leaders. This is the hardest time. And so I thank you as a mother and as a parent for everything y'all do every single day for all of our babies across the country. But we have an opportunity. And young people are looking forward to us coming up with a solution for what learning looks like. And I'll say the other opportunity we have is to really engage young people as a part of that conversation and have their voices be a part of the story of reshaping what learning looks like. And I'll also say one other thing, right? Like, the devices aren't leading the learning, right? The devices aren't informing how learning is happening. What I learned, the biggest learning I had in the pandemic was, and you talked, Graham, a little bit about like all of the different kind of approaches to technology. In the pandemic, all of a sudden the device became the technology. But what we learned was the idea of a 21st century classroom. I think about it a lot. And I think about it from my very young space of when I was a student in school. It was like those big computers with the clear backs, and like we were like impressed that we had a room full of them. And then when I was a teacher, it was smart boards in every classroom, and then it was laptops and iPad carts, and then we hit the pandemic and everybody had to go remote. But what we learned was it wasn't any piece of technology, it was about the interaction of the adult, the student, with the technology, and if we're not doing that effectively, then it is simply a distraction in our schools and in our classrooms.
Yeah, Catherine, I guess the, you know, as Meisha was saying, there was that sort of hope, wasn't there, post-pandemic of building back better. Actually, in many ways, things seem to have got worse, right? Or certainly not improved. I mean, do you sense that, the sort of intensification of use and the distractions it's been causing?
I think definitely. I see that on the personal front too, that everyone started to use screens more during the pandemic because we had to, but we haven't really had that reset moment. I agree, Meisha, there was this huge moment of opportunity, and we haven't fully taken advantage of that. I think for schools, for sure. I mean, I know that, you know, my daughter's now in 4th grade. That's something that teachers of, well, you guys know this, but teachers of kids that age were all grappling with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Graham, we'll talk a little bit more about your approach to all this, but just give us a sense of, as it were, the kind of broader policy pressure or demand for change in terms of, you know, legislation or guidance. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing both within the US and elsewhere in terms of a pushback against, you know, free and excessive use, should we say, of phones in the classroom?
Well, I think the zeitgeist has changed tremendously. So again, 10 years ago, there was no talk or legislation around limiting or restricting or, you know, creating phone-free spaces in general. If you cut to now, most states in the country are moving on legislation. Abroad, you know, as a company, we're in 35 different countries, and everyone is at a different point, I think, around legislating. An important distinction that we've learned over time is sometimes you'll hear the word phone ban. Mm-hmm. And for us, we've been very careful to kind of architect a solution that's around the concept of phone-free, because again, it's not punitive. And if you're talking about cultural change for young people, it's not about taking something away from young kids. They're not doing anything wrong. You're trying to educate young people how to use technology in a constructive way in their life. So what does that look like? You have to talk about the benefits they're going to get. And so I think legislation goes a long way because it frees up funding and it educates teachers who don't need much education around the subject because they know it, but mostly parents about what's actually happening. Because every parent, what we found at a cultural level is, every parent is worried about, if they have a teenage kid, what does it mean for them to grow up with TikTok in their pocket, to spend endless hours on YouTube? Are they developing critical thinking faculties? Are they socializing? What is that going to do to them? And it's a big nebulous problem people are trying to unwind. And I guess our answer to that has been to say, a phone-free school is a concrete thing you can do, a practical step you can take to affect those other things in a positive way. And that's generally what we see is, once a kid gets used to spending 8 hours a day off their phone, that behavior, that new habit translates to other parts of their life. That's what we've seen.
Yeah.
So let's move into some structured questions a little bit, and I'll go around our panelists, and then we'll open it up a little bit later. So if we go to the first, let's start with you, Meisha, and let's look at it from the sort of the perspective of the school principal administrator. So first question here. So what advice would you give to administrators considering a phone-free policy for their school?
Yeah, I mean, I would start where Graham ended. Like, we should not be having a conversation about creating punitive practices around phone-free spaces. Language matters. And I would ask a question, right? Like, what's most important to you for your students? From my perspective, the most important work that happens in any school system happens in classrooms between our students and their teachers, right? And that needs to be sacred space. And so the first thing I would say is, if you consider that sacred space, what conditions are you creating to elevate those spaces? What resources are you giving to your teachers? What time are you giving to your teachers, right? I know teachers across New York City, and I'm sure across the country, don't want to be at the front of a conversation about cell phones, because when we started the conversation when I was a principal, it really was about a punitive approach to just taking their cell phones away. We didn't have the knowledge and information that we have today about the harms and the dangers of social media, the mental health issues and concerns. Like, we didn't know that, but we know it now. And so if what's most important to a school leader is what happens between our teachers and babies in classrooms, what are you doing to create the conditions for that safe space to be sacred? And I would say, right, that starts by giving teachers, whether it is depending on where you sit in the classroom, whether it's a 45-minute, 50-minute block of time, or a full day because you're a K-8 educator, it's giving them more time to engage in learning and to engage their young people in learning time.
Okay, let's go to our next question then for you, Meisha. So what unexpected outcomes did you see when your school went phone-free? And tell us a little bit about just the timescale of your experience of doing this.
Well, I will say, so the first thing I saw was kids weren't angry. Right? Most people are like, the kids are gonna go wild if you take their cell phones. And of course, they're kids, they're teenagers. Of course, it is their job to at first be resistant. Let's all agree, right? So of course they have to present resistance. But I think what they found is they found time to talk to each other in the cafeteria. That's when you want to really hear them talking to each other. Like, you want to hear the noise of the cafeteria. There's a joyful noise in the cafeteria. We also know when the noise is not joyful in the cafeteria. But I think for me, that was the biggest thing. And the timeline was actually from my seat as a superintendent in New York City, the school that I was a principal of, my favorite school, the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice, where I still think I'm the principal. Don't tell them. They actually know. But it was, I went there, and we were like, when I was the principal, it was like, no cell phone, no cell phone, no cell phones. Young people felt empowered because they got to keep their phone. When I was there, we were taking phones. When I left and my colleague, my former AP became the principal, she implemented Yondr, and young people got to control their device by keeping it in their presence. And so I think for me, what I saw was young people had agency and ownership of disconnecting themselves, right? And so they were empowered in some of the decision making. But I think the biggest thing was young people engaging in the ways we want them to, at recess, right? In their free school time, instead of being connected to the device, they were connecting with each other. And isn't that what we want more of anyway?
So that's the important point. So your policy was not just in the classroom, but on the premises, basically.
Child, I was old school, honey. I took everything. I took cell phones, I took hoodies, I took everything. I was the taker. And we've learned a lot. Look, all the people laughing will take us too. I know it. I know my people when I see them. But, you know, that was a different time, right? And so now I think the shift is more around how do we ensure that young people have agency around some of the decisions that we're making for them, and that we stop making decisions for them, but that we start making decisions with them.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, let's look at this third question, so around the role of community involvement. So how significant was that, and what ways can that play out to sustain?
Well, you cannot implement a phone-free space if parents aren't part of the conversation, period. And I say that as a mother, you know, who sent kids to school with cell phones. And, you know, like you know, we're all very connected to our kids. And so, you know, parents have to be a part of the conversation. We can't start the conversation with just ourselves, and we can't implement policy, even at the school building level, without thinking about what are some of the concerns and the questions that families have. And what I found is, you know, and I'll tell you a funny story. So my mom, we have Sunday dinner, we have to put our cell phones to the side. If Graham comes over, she's gonna make him leave some pouches at the house so she can pouch our cell phones. But like, I'm a woman of a certain age, and when I go home for Sunday dinner, like, we're not allowed to have our phones at the table. And so there's an expectation that we connect. And so what I found is that parents were saying, once we started having these conversations, they're like, maybe we'll start using that pouch at home too, to say during homework time you don't have your phone, or during dinner time we put the phones away, so that it doesn't become just about what happens in the schoolhouse, it becomes about what happens in our family, in our homes, and in our lives.
And that said, did you get much resistance also from the families? Was there more than
I think that I think the family concern, and I know we're going to go to this question, but it's always about safety. It's always about their fears and concerns about their children being safe and being able to reach them. And I think when you address that, and I know there are a bunch of school leaders and folk in this room, in an emergency, the last thing we want is phone calls going directly to students and from students to families. It interrupts the emergency response team's ability to respond appropriately, to know where to respond, and to know what the issue is that they're actually responding to. And so I think when you have when we have those conversations with parents, and you have a clear line of how you're going to communicate in emergency situations, they're at the table. Because you know what? I mean, there are a bunch of us that are parents in this room. How many of us are like, all right, enough with the phone? Like, we need to talk to each other. Put the phone down. Like, I need you to disconnect for a little while. And we're doing that in our homes. And so don't we want that in our schools? And don't we want that time for learning to happen?
Sure. So we'll come back to the parental issue in a minute. But Graham, now let's shift and tell us a little bit about Yondr. You touched on this, but a little bit about the creation, how it works, what your expectations are really about what you can deliver.
Sure. Again, in 2014, the core idea for Yondr was the creation of phone-free space. Phone-free spaces. So if you've heard that term, that's where it started. And the two pillars of the company from the beginning have been in education and live performance. So some people come to know Yondr through live performances and comedians, and we help create phone-free spaces for them because it's important, I think, for their art form, and it's also important for adults to experience stepping into a phone-free space for 3 hours and kind of going through a microcosm of what we're talking about for kids in education. But the other side was obviously geared towards education and creating that 6 to 8 hour space for students to just be kids and develop this frame of reference around technology to learn how to responsibly use it. But the motivation came from, like I said before, looking at the tech world and where things were going and kind of not agreeing necessarily with where I thought they were going to go. I thought that there were going to need to be these protected spaces, and the analog that I've used in my head for a long time is the creation of a national park system. And that's how I see phone-free spaces, and that's how I see what Yondr does, is through modern urban society, we create these phone-free spaces that are protected, almost sacred spaces, like Meisha said. Because if you want things to thrive in a certain space, technology is useful in endless ways, but things like family dinner, things like parts of education, like live experience, they have this tendency to erode the primacy, I think, of those experiences. And there's also, I think especially for digital natives, but everyone feels this, there's something about a blinking screen and everything that happens online that is endlessly titillating and stimulating. And it feels realer than real. And it's very alluring for everybody because there's no risk involved. You can always text people rather than talk to them in person because there's no element of risk. You don't have to have the sense of an awkward conversation or looking someone in the eye. And the fact is that I think humans will always take a path of least resistance, like any creature. So if young people don't develop the muscles, the facility for those kind of interactions, for that kind of critical thinking or sustained attention, how will they ever know they should have had it? And so when you think about that big question of how do you try to engender young people with that, I think phone-free spaces is a solid way to start and give them the experience rather than just talking about it.
And just for those who aren't familiar, just describe a little bit how the Yondr approach
works.
Of course. Physically, if you like.
Yeah, of course. No, so in a school, what we provide is really, it's a program. A lot of people know about us through the pouch. I would say the pouch is a quarter of what we do as a company. And if you were to zoom into a school day and you're a kid going to a Yondr school, you're assigned a pouch at the beginning of the school day. As you go into the building, at the beginning of school, your phone and all your wearable tech goes inside, you close it, it locks, and the student maintains possession of it. But the expectation and the policy throughout the day is it's now a phone-free school day. We have medical pouches for students who have medical needs, and there's a million other wrinkles and flexibility in the system. But the primary idea is giving students a bell-to-bell phone-free day. And at the end of school, as they walk out, they just tap the pouch unlocking mechanism and it unlocks. So in terms of the majority of the work we do, though, again, going back 11 years, we used to help schools on a classroom-by-classroom basis. And we'd hear from teachers saying, I need help. We learned really quickly that did not work. It put teachers in the position of having to be the phone police and having to be the ones wrestling with students all day. You had different teachers with different management styles, classroom management styles. But the most important was you weren't giving kids the psychological break of 6 to 8 hours a day, and you weren't putting them all in a bucket together and saying, hey, you're not missing out on anything. Everyone's in the same boat together. You weren't creating a new ritual, which is what we're trying to do. So a lot of our program work is really talking to parents, teachers, students, and administrators and saying, hey, your district or your school is going phone free. What does that mean? What questions do you have? Because it is a community action, like Meisha said. You have to get everyone on board. Then we actually help with the rollout and the implementation and then the ongoing support.
Okay, so let's move to your next question. So tell us about the most common objections to phone-free policies and how to address them.
I think Meisha already touched on a couple of them really well. I think one big one that is quickly changing is this idea that students are going to react so violently against a phone-free school day. What we find very consistently is after 2 to 3 weeks, students won't always tell you to your face, but if you're one-on-one to the side, they might say, you know what, I thought I was not going to like this, and I kind of feel a sense of relief. I kind of like it. And that's really common for us. We also hear that more lunches are being eaten at lunchtime. And you'd think, oh, it's because students aren't distracted. What we actually hear is students are not afraid any longer of being videotaped or recorded in an embarrassing situation. So again, the idea of a safe space, if you think about what that's like to be a teenager walking through the world and worried about being at a school dance and being recorded and posted online, it's no wonder there's anxiety. You'd be crazy not to. So that's kind of a common one we hear is the student perspective. And I think there's a general one maybe that's changed a lot in the last 3 years that is kind of like the genie can't be put back in the bottle. Technology's moving, we've just got to move, we got to teach kids how to use these tools, which I agree, we do need to teach kids how to use these tools. But how do we do that? Is it by talking to them all the time about it, or is it creating some structure and habits around something? And the other one I'd say, as Meisha I think touched on really well, is just parents. A lot of parents are normalized in communicating with their student all day, every day, about simple things, logistical things. Who's picking you up for soccer practice? What are you doing? And in the first part of our policy work, of working with the district, we just help them outline something that's really clear with their parent community, answer questions about how they want them to communicate and how that's going to go. And we find that that goes away really fast.
Okay, and then Meisha touched on this as well, but let's talk about that question of emergencies, which
Yeah.
is obviously a big fear. How Graham, do you handle that? Or?
Yeah, of course. And again, we've been hearing and answering this question for 11 years, and I think it's an unfortunate reality that things like this happen in the country. The important thing, though, is talking with the parent community about what the flow of communication in an emergency is going to be. That's number one. And we always defer to law enforcement, but really the answer now from law enforcement pretty much countrywide is that in an emergency, they want students paying attention to the adult in the room, following instructions. That's the number one thing, and not jamming up first responder lines or sending misinformation. But with the Yondr program, also students maintain possession of their pouches at all time, their property. So in a lockdown, they're able to access it when it's safe, unlock, and contact family, in addition to every teacher having access to their phones, of course, and a clear policy. So I think that goes a really long way to helping people get comfortable with the concept of a phone-free school and the benefits. But the other is, that's less known, I think, is we're being brought in now by a lot of safety and security directors in districts around the country because so much of the day-to-day violence in schools, the majority is driven through phones and social media. So the amount of unwanted recording in locker rooms and bathrooms, the amount of fights that are orchestrated, the type of bullying that happens now is like, it's in a different dimension than when I was a kid. Things don't simmer down overnight, they heat up, and they're brought right into the school day. So what we find, one of the first stats that we look for and we hear from districts is a wild reduction in disciplinary issues after Yondr's introduced. Because that whole dynamic, the social dynamics, are gone. That doesn't exist anymore. Kids are still kids, and there's still going to be things. But that day-to-day violence that's happening inside of the school, so much that goes through the phone, that's obviously something we address up front.
And just want to add, I think the other thing is it helps us define what emergencies are. right? We know what the big emergencies are, but sometimes students are get information from their parents that spirals them into crisis, and the school doesn't know what's happening. And so if there's a tragedy in the family, if there is an emergency at home, like, you want a trusted adult to be with your young person when they're getting and or receiving that information. And so I think that, you know, we talked about community and conversations. Starting this, you know, thinking about this question around how schools handle emergencies also opens the door to have conversations with schools and parents about what are actual emergencies, right? And who you want to be there with your child when they are getting some level of information that might create a crisis. Do you want them to be alone and go to a bathroom or try to leave the building to solve the thing? Or do you want them to get their amazing principal or teacher by their side so that you can actually get the resolve that you want, which is either to pick up your child or to get your child into a safe space with a trusted adult? And so I think this idea of, you know, our children are receiving firsthand information that you really want an adult with them when they receive is another important emergency that this helps us raise in conversation with schools and parents together.
And Graham, just give us a sense of, you know, post-going phone-free in schools. What sort of impact are you seeing? What results in schools?
Well, again, one of the first is a reduction in fights and disciplinary issues. We see improved academic outcomes, improved test scores. We see, I already mentioned, more lunches being eaten at the cafeteria. We hear stats like more library books being checked out in the first 3 weeks than the entire previous year, which, if you think about that, is a wild statistic. But the main things that we look for and we hear are also anecdotal. So teachers say simple things like, I see kids' eyes again, or their posture, students' posture has completely changed, or that, you know, kids are playing basketball or playing soccer again at lunch, which to me are all things you would kind of expect, but you have to see it to actually believe that it's possible to put the genie back in the bottle. It just turns out when you kind of temporarily remove the anesthetizing agent, things come back to life very, very quickly. And that's all it takes. Kids are very resilient.
So let's bring it down to the personal, as it were, Catherine. So you've written this great book, which I believe is on sale here, as well as elsewhere. So tell us a little bit about strategies, how to build healthier phone habits. It's something for students, although arguably for many of us as well, I'm sure.
But I have to respond to some of the amazing, like, I'm sitting here, you probably see me like nodding along, like, yes, so thank you for everything you guys have said. And just a couple things on those notes. For emergencies, fascinating and violence, it's fascinating to recognize how much is being prevented in schools. I actually hadn't thought about that before, because it's so much focused on what might happen from someone coming into the school, but not what's happening in the school. So that's really helpful. I've also heard from administrators that there's another aspect of reducing anxiety by having phones out of schools, because if there is, God forbid, an emergency at another school, then quickly the information spreads. So I was talking to someone from Dubuque, Iowa, and they were saying that, you know, it might not even be true, but a rumor will be started across the state that something is happening in another school. And then every kid in every school finds out about this in the middle of math class. And then all of a sudden, no kid's paying attention to math because now they think that there's a school shooter. So I think that's another thing to think of. I also wanted to just highlight something both of you have touched on, which is the importance that this be from bell to bell and not just be during the class time, because I know that there's so much discrepancy right now between different schools' policies on this. And the reason that I firmly believe it should be bell to bell, and I think that you guys would agree as well, is that you're protecting those interstitial moments in the school day. You're making it possible for kids to have the interactions in the cafeteria, to go to the library, to have those awkward moments and build relationships. And Graham, I remember talking to you once, and you used a beautiful metaphor, I thought, where you were talking about how this idea of the sacred space, and if you're in a space with people and no one's on their phone, there's almost this bubble of energy around you. And every time someone pulls out a phone, and even if they're just checking it for a second or sending it one text, it's like little pinpricks in the roof of that space. I don't know if you remember using that. It was very powerful. I loved it. So I just want to emphasize the importance of really keeping this phone-free, schools phone-free from bell to bell. I also wanted to highlight some concrete resources in addition to strategies, because it just occurred to me as we're talking that I helped to build some resource kits for the Anxious Generation's website. They're free, and it's for how to create a phone-free school. And we did 3 versions. One's for parents, one's for educators, and one's for school administrators. So you might want to check it out. We basically compiled resources from other organizations and people that we thought were high quality, and then put them in one spot. One in particular that was helpful, I think it's from everyschool.org, maybe one of you knows this, but it's a actual step-by-step guide, pretty much a plug-and-play guide that if you're thinking about trying to go phone-free, here's how you should start the process. And like Graham was saying and alluding to, you don't want to just roll it out on one day and surprise everybody. I have a friend who's a teacher. One day in October, his school just went phone-free. They didn't tell anybody. They didn't even tell the teachers. And it was like, you can imagine how well that went. There were no Yondr pouches at that school. So his job got a lot harder instead of easier. So anyway, those are some resources you might want to check out that I found useful. And then one other thing before I get to practical strategies, when we're talking about the value to young people that having a phone-free school day can bring, it reminds me of a talk I recently heard from a young man named Sean Killingsworth, who's an amazing 23-year-old young man. Hopefully you'll hear more about. He started a movement called Reconnect. I want to connect you too. I've already thought about this, probably you as well. But he started a movement on college campuses to bring people together for phone-free experiences. And he sent me this keynote that he'd given, and in it, I mean, I was just crying while I was watching it, because I think a lot of times adults, and if there's any parents in the room, we worry about the FOMO of what's gonna happen if kids get left out. This is slightly off the topic of the schools, but I think that we'll bring it back. But we don't kind of recognize what kids are missing out on when we allow them to have phones and social media. And what Sean was saying is that what he thinks adults don't get about his generation, like 23 and younger, is we're like, oh, you know, go phone free, engage with the real world. And he says, unless you have more kids who are phone free, there is no real world for us to engage in. We don't have that opportunity. It is a barren ecosystem, as he calls it. And I realized, oh my God, like that is another reason this is so urgent, and it is so important that we get phones out of schools to create these phone-free spaces so kids build those skills to relate to each other, and that they build these real-life interests, and they're able to engage with the real world. So to me personally, I feel like the stakes couldn't be higher, and having a phone-free school space is one of the best ways to start because it gives them 8 hours a day. I mean, adults don't have that. And so when I think about it, I think of it as a really empowering gift to give kids. We have to figure out how to get their buy-in, although as we're hearing, they have less pushback than we might expect. But God, how great would it be for any of us to have a phone-free school day? I want to just like tag along to Yondr events and just, even if I don't care about the performer, and just like show up and be like, do you guys get the energy? Anyway, so to answer your actual question there, I think there's lots of strategies that we can use to help students, but one that comes to mind for the school day is that in my ideal world, what would happen is you would provide the freedom to have a phone-free school day, but you also would couple that with you being all of us, with education as to why that's important,
yes.
You know? Because I think the problem, as we all know, is that no kid responds well to an adult wagging their finger at them and telling them what to do. You're all teachers, you know that. The best way to connect with kids is to come at them from their level. And so how do we do that in the classroom? How do we actually educate kids as to how their enemy is not the adults. Their enemy really is these tech companies that are making money off of stealing their lives from them, literally from under their noses. You know, I actually read another interesting editorial recently by a young person. It was in, I think he was 18 and he's a sophomore. No, that doesn't match. But anyway, he was about 18 years old. But he was just talking about how traditionally young people rebel against their parents. And he was saying maybe the time has come for young people to recognize that they actually are on the same side as like the Gen Xers and the millennials, like we're actually right. And that the real rebellion needs to happen against the tech companies. And so I think that that's a very important thing for us to get across in schools, and there's a lot of ways to do that, to educate kids as to how they are being manipulated, what the attention economy is, meaning how social media companies in particular make money off of them. We could educate kids about some of the horrifying things that social media companies have done to infiltrate schools. If you guys want some super fun homework reading, and I actually think you might think this is fun, there's a, I can't believe I'm gonna say this, a great multi-district litigation, like lawsuit, filed on behalf of multiple school districts against the social media companies. And you can get it in unredacted form and have a little fun bedtime reading tonight. And it actually goes through some of the strategies that companies such as TikTok, Snap, Instagram, Meta, well, you know, Instagram is Meta, what they have done to get into schools and get the maximum number of students onto their platforms in the minimum amount of time. I'm getting mad because they specifically know that that is how to get people hooked at a young age on their products. It's just like tobacco. It's just like what Big Tobacco did. They even have gone so far as to Instagram has, and Meta, they've infiltrated PTAs and created back to school guides that push the idea that parents should be grateful for their kids to be on Instagram, and that of all the social media, like, their platform is the one to be on. And they actually have used geolocating data from the kids' phones to determine how many kids open their phones in school, at what time.
Wow.
And then they've used like push notifications to try to get the maximum number of kids to sign up, in this case it's Instagram, in the minimum amount of time. So this is the kind of stuff I think if kids knew about, they would be like, what? You know, they would actually get angry, and I think it's a situation in which some righteous anger can be good, and we can channel that and combine it with the phone-free school day to create a true cultural shift here. And one of the things that gets me the most excited when we talk about this is the idea that for us adults, we didn't have this opportunity. Like, phones came into our lives so quickly and they infiltrated everything so thoroughly that we never established an etiquette for how and when it's appropriate to use them. And I know from my experience, you know, hearing from adults with how to break up with your phone, that's having a huge effect on adults. But our kids have an opportunity, if we give it to them, to reset that. Like Graham's saying, you know, we can put that genie back in the bottle way more than we think we can. And in my optimistic moments about the future, which do exist, I imagine that these kids who have phone-free schools, they get used to the idea that you don't have a phone out when you're trying to learn. You don't have a phone out when you're having a conversation with your friend. That becomes the new norm. They look at us like we're the crazy ones, you know? And you have a whole generation of young people who enter the workforce where this is the norm, and they are able to actually have relationships and have experiences. And I think that that all can start with a phone-free school day.
And then let's look at the kind of the pushback around that fear of missing out, the whole question of the anxiety of being disconnected. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I say, you know, we are so focused on what our kids are missing out on if they don't have phones. We need to take a bigger picture look and think, what are they missing out on if they do have phones? And they're missing out on everything around them. They are literally missing out on eye contact. There's a great quote, I believe it's from another lawsuit. If you guys really want to go deep, ask me in the Q&A, I'll give you references. But there's a TikTok executive who was quoted. It was in an unredacted version of the Kentucky Attorney General lawsuit, I'm remembering now. And he talks about how TikTok executives are aware of some of the opportunities that use of TikTok gets in the way of, for example, sleeping, walking around the room, and looking people in the eye. It's a direct quote from an executive. And they also admit in this lawsuit, in the unredacted portion, that they are aware that kids who are on TikTok more actually struggle more with empathy, cognitive abilities, and strategic thinking. Like, it's crazy. So I think parents and educators, we need to keep in mind that we have our FOMO oriented the wrong way. And then I also say to focus on the opposite of FOMO, which is JOMO, the underappreciated joy of missing out, where it's a joy to not know about all the drama that's going on with your classmates and be able to focus on the real moment. I think we all could, you know, have JOMO right now for whatever you're missing that's currently waiting for you in your email inboxes. Like, you're actually get excited, you know, so that's how I frame it, is really to think about it differently. I feel like Meisha has.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Jomo, that's my new thing. But I think the other thing is, right, like, and we talked about this a bit earlier, you address this by including young people in the conversation before you implement a policy around a phone-free space, period. And you know, like, the anxiety around being disconnected, you get an understanding of what it is connected to. Right? What are young people afraid of? And they may have some real fears, right? In New York State, the commissioner, who is supportive of phone-free spaces, but, you know, based on recent policy, has said, you know, from executive order land, has said, you know, I'm really worried about, I've heard from young people who have immigrant parents that they're afraid they're going to miss a phone call, right? Well, do we want that phone call to go directly to a kid first? Or do you want a trusted adult to be there so they can provide support, appropriate support? And so let's understand what young people are anxious about so we can put a solve in place for them. And I think that is what I want folks to walk away from, and, you know, just think about the voice of young people in a conversation in this moment is critically important. They want to have ownership and agency over their learning. They also want to have ownership and agency over that which belongs to them, their device, that their parents, all of us, spend a lot of money on, right? And so they want to have ownership of it, and keeping it allows it, but unpacking what the anxieties are will probably take you down a path of really something else you actually need to solve for.
Yeah, the role of the educator as the trusted intermediary is really important.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that and talk a bit more about the anxiety, I think we also need to recognize it's real. I mean, I was just saying to Amy before we started this panel, I'm doing a phone breakup challenge based on my book with adults who are on my newsletter list, and there's a chat feature, and I was like, yay, people are gonna share. Well, some of the things they shared, it's like one woman's like, I put my phone away and it's not in my bedroom. I was very anxious last night. And she goes, I got so anxious that I started to spiral, and I actually had to take anti-anxiety medication. And I was like, oh my God. And she's like, I'm not sure that I can do this challenge. And I'm like, what am I doing? This is like, I am not actually a psychologist or psychiatrist. What have I done? But my point being, it's real even for adults. We've been so conditioned to rely on our phones in case of supposed emergencies. I really think it's important to, like you're saying, to identify what's an actual emergency as opposed to just an anxious moment. But we need to help everybody recognize that anxiety and sit with it a bit more. And I think there's lots of solutions that we can provide to people, either for how to cope or to deal with it. That's one of the reasons I love the fact that Yondr actually has this onboarding. It's not just like, here's a pouch, see you later. It's like, how do you deal with it? But it's even things like, okay, let's actually talk about what happens. Like, let the parents know for sure, how will you communicate in an emergency, right? And then what if they do have those logistical things during the day where it's not an emergency, but they have a dentist appointment? Well, I remember in my high school, we just had a bulletin board, and it had like their folded up pieces of paper, and it would say, Catherine, and then it would say, you have a dentist appointment at 4. And then if I needed to call somebody, I'd go to the front desk. But I think we forget those kind of common sense, easy analog solutions. So I think we need to acknowledge the anxiety, but there also are ways to figure out how to deal with it so that people can move forward. I feel like you're about to say something, Graham.
Oh, no, just that idea of, I think, allowing students to maintain possession of their phones. What I've seen with adults, it shows as well, is if you want to develop a new habit, it's important to think about how does technology, especially your phone, affect you? Many different effects. To me, it's primarily at a physical level. And so a student whose phone is in a pouch, when you have that phantom reflex to reach into your pocket, you feel the phone vibrate, and your phone then touches a pouch, it interrupts an impulse, and it allows a new neural pathway to form, which is teaching, that is educating around a habit, and that can have tremendous knock-on effects, especially when it's paired with an overarching guide for young people about the effects of technology and social media and a way to navigate that world. So the approach that I've found, I think, and educators have found works is a practical, kind of physical element to it paired with a theoretical and intellectual understanding of it.
Sure. So one more question to you, Catherine, and then I'm going to open it up. So do please, any of you in the audience who want to ask questions, feel free to start coming towards the mic so everyone can hear. But Catherine, just a final thought on educators and parents, so how they can work together to help their students use devices more mindfully.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to model the behaviors we want students to have and our children to have. So if you're telling your kid or telling your students to not be on their phone in class or at the dinner table and then you're on your phone, that's not modeling good behavior. So I think that, again, the trick, to me at least, is to come at it as equals rather than top down, and in fact sometimes even to switch the dynamic and ask kids what they think of us. As particularly if you're a parent, this is a brave question if you dare to ask your kid, but ask your kid, what do you think of how I use my phone when I'm around you? How do you feel when I'm on my phone when you're around? Because they will say stuff, like they notice us. And so I think that's a good entry point. I love what Graham is saying about actually using the sensation of the Yondr pouch as a teaching moment. One thing I recommend to adults, which you're all welcome to try, just to back up, like Graham's saying, we've been conditioned to reach for our phones on autopilot to the point that we almost don't notice it because our brain's dopamine systems have been hacked by the tech designers. And so that's why we often end up with our phone in our hand as adults and don't know what happened to the last 30 minutes. So one thing I often suggest to adults is that they put a rubber band or a hair tie around their phone so that when they reach for their phone on autopilot, you have this moment of being like, why is there a rubber band on my phone? And that's a prompt to make you realize, I picked up my phone. Then you can ask, why did I pick it up right now? Did I have a purpose that was real, or was there an emotional reason, like I was anxious or lonely or whatever? And then you can pick an alternative to do, which might be that you still want to use the phone, but it's a conscious choice. But in many cases, you'll realize, oh, I actually was looking for a distraction. I'd never thought about the idea of using the Yondr pouch itself as that. And I really like that because it means that it could be incorporated in a school setting where it's like you actually use if you're using a Yondr pouch, that as itself a teaching moment, and then you can continue that conversation at home. So in school, it's like, let's actually have a moment to acknowledge you're all feeling anxious right now, probably, and let's like notice how we feel when we reach for the phone and there's an impediment. And then you could bring it home and say, all right, well, tonight's assignment is like, have your parents put a rubber band around their phones and then try this out with them. And I think there's a lot of ways, like, other things you could do at home, like hopefully your kid will have a phone-free school day, but can there be device-free dinners at home? Can there be a ritual? I love the idea of rituals in sacred spaces of, just as you're saying, with your mom. It's like that that you always put the phone away at dinner, but maybe it extends so Friday nights is like a family night. Like, just as an example, if anyone wants to try it, this coming Friday is the Global Day of Unplugging, where people around the world will be taking a 24-hour break from their phones. So if you are going back to your school and want to invite students to do it, it's like very well timed. I think for sure, like modeling good tech habits at home, like getting phones out of bedrooms is very important. They should not be in anyone's bedroom at night. And really, like asking your kid, like you can always blame, if you're a parent wondering about this and you're trying to get your kids buy-in, you can always say that you're trying to help yourself and ask them to do you a favor by taking a break for the Global Day of Unplugging, because you want them to help you instead of you top-down telling them. So just a couple ideas off the top of my head.
Some great thoughts. So let's move to questions. We've got a bunch. That's great. Please, go first.
Hi, is this working?
Yep.
I live in a district where there's actually substantial parent pushback to getting phones out, and especially from the lower income families who have a lot of logistics that they need to deal with during the day. And I've been arguing your points a lot, so I agree with you. But I'm curious about how you successfully roll this out, and not just roll out, but really build understanding within the various kind of stakeholders, including students, parents, teachers. There's some pushback from teachers as well. I hear that you have a rollout with Yondr, but I feel like we would need more than just like a rollout. We would need to build some understanding.
Yeah.
I'll start, and then you want to?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I mean, I think the biggest thing that I've learned since I've been partnered with Yondr is it's not a pouch, it's a program, right? And so we don't deliver pouches to the building. Like, that is not the first step in becoming a Yondr partner school. It is really thinking about the issues that you are grappling with, the pushback that you're getting, thinking about those things together and coming up with a process for implementation in your district. And, I led schools in the Bronx, probably we have had similar pushback from families around being connected to their kids for logistical issues. And I find that, again, it is what are those, and really unpacking them together so that parents also don't want to feel, and we know this because there's a loud, there's a megaphone around this. Parents also don't want us to just tell them what we are going to do in school buildings and in classrooms without them being a part of the conversation in a very real way. And so I feel like the districts where I've experienced or seen the most pushback is when the leader of a district has just made a decision, or the leader of a school has just made a decision and decided that is what it is, and people haven't had a voice at the table.
Yeah, and being sensitive to time, but I would say there's a million things in the nooks and crannies that are really important. So, how parents can communicate with their kids. The way we work it is there's flexibility in the system. So if a student in some districts needs to use a phone, they can tell their teacher, go to the central office and unlock it there. If the school wants to use Yondr, let's say, on a field trip or for sporting events on the bus, it can be installed there. So it's all in the details, but for us, the rollout and the pre-planning is all the way down to policy guidance and actually communication template letters to parents that the district can personalize. They know their community, and then also down to the site level support and professional development and training. So it's kind of a stepwise approach where you have to get everyone to go, okay, we all understand that, we agree, great. What's unique about your community and what are you worried about? Okay, got through that, all the way to the rollout. But if you don't go through the checkpoints and answer all the questions it sounds like are arising, that's when you hit snags.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question, please.
Hi, my name is Lauren Pear. I'm from the organization Fair Play. And quickly to connect to what Catherine said about some of the guides, one of them is we partnered with the Phone Free Schools movement, and I believe that the Anxious Generation cited that. So there's one for administrators, and there's also one for parents, teachers.
It's you guys, I'm so sorry.
That's
I'm thinking
okay.
about the ed tech triangle. Yes, Fair Play.
Which is great too, yeah. And so a question I had is that we love Yondr. There are other solutions too. We're kind of solution agnostic, but we do really like Yondr. We have this guide we put so much work into. We don't have these connections with the school system. So for an organization that doesn't have that sort of infrastructure with the school system, maybe this is best for Meisha, but anyone that has an idea could jump in. How would you advise being most effective in reaching out to administrators or teachers or schools to try to get them to adopt the phone-free bell-to-bell model?
I think we're in an interesting moment where legislation is coming requiring schools to do it. And I think what we found is that in those spaces, as a starting point, people want to have a conversation. And so I would suggest starting out in those places where you already see legislation beginning to roll out, because I don't think folks, in New York City, there were schools using Yondr. We just started, our governor just put out some legislation recently, and so we're waiting for the budget to pass and for it to finalize. But I expect that the schools that aren't Yondr schools or haven't come up with a solution are going to look to people who have been talking about it. And so I would say a starting point might be where is legislation rolling out where people are looking for answers?
And maybe even where legislation is going through the process,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
It's a great idea, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, please, next.
Hi, my name is Theodora. I have a background in clinical psychology, but I'm the director of well-being currently at a children's online safety organization. And I've been following Yondr for a long time. Catherine, I'm subscribed to your Substack, bought your merchandise. You guys should check it out. She has some wonderful mugs. They're very good. I use them every morning. So my question is, I've been in the digital wellness space for about 10 years. I've been collaborating with organizations like Fair Play, Center for Humane Tech, a lot of others. And this is a question not so much sort of the context of phone bans when it comes to parental engagement, but really generally children's online safety. Mm-hmm. One of the things that sort of I still struggle with, and I'll be presenting on this on Thursday, actually, parental engagement in children's online safety, mm-hmm. is I haven't seen a significant improvement over the last decade in terms of parents really engaging with this topic of online safety, with some of the risks. One of the things we would maybe assume is that consumption of digital content would have maybe gone down, right, if parental sort of awareness or education was a little bit higher. But I saw a frightening statistic a couple of days ago that something like 42 to 3% of 2 to 5-year-olds binge on YouTube content, which is one of these statistics that makes me want to quit what I'm doing and completely change profession, because I feel like a failure, right, after a decade of kind of trying to raise awareness around this. So just from your different perspectives of, having spoken to parents in different contexts, what are your thoughts around that? Are you seeing improvements? What do you think we need to do in order to, again, not necessarily ban anything, but just really raise awareness and just get families to think about online safety from that perspective of child development, age-appropriate usage, media literacy, and all these fantastic things that I think all of us are trying to work on.
Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for raising that, because I think that is something that comes up a lot when I do talks on this subject, is that parents are very concerned about safety in the real world, but they're not concerned enough at all about online safety. And one of the fun things I've been doing recently is looking into statistics on sexual predators on the internet. That I don't recommend doing before bed. You can read the lawsuits that I mentioned, but it's terrifying. And I've given talks where I've talked about, there's actually a great PSA if you want to freak yourself out, but actually make this point succinctly, a PSA from the New York FBI office about Roblox and sexual predators on Roblox. And it explains how sextortion works. And it's only a minute and a half. It's very compelling. And I remember showing it at a talk in DC. Part of me was like, oh, am I over-exaggerating this problem? A man came up to me afterwards and he said, I work in the prosecutor's office for this type of crime, and it's so much worse than you can imagine. It's all day, every day. So I think I don't have an easy answer to your question, but I think the message that we need to get out to people is that we're so concerned about real life safety, and we are overlooking the fact that most predators are online. If you were a sexual predator and you wanted to create an app to target children, what better than Snapchat? Where you can contact kids, you can send photos, the messages evaporate, you can see where people are on a map. I mean, that's how we have to be thinking about it. So I think that maybe phrasing it that way, and also emphasizing that you may think your kid is safer because they're at home in their bedroom on their computer or their screen. In reality, you have no idea where your kid is, and you have no idea who's in touch with them. And so I always say to people who are considering giving their child a smartphone, you have to make sure that you are ready for them to have access to the entire internet, and you also have to be ready for the entire internet to have access to your child. And so that's kind of how I message it. And I think that the answer to the whole what do we do about the real world, I do think also kids need to have more real world experience and freedom. So one quick follow-up I forgot to mention in our conversation about phone-free schools is that you can't just take the phones away, you have to provide experiences.
Yep.
So many ideas for how to do so. I'm sure Graham has tons, and everybody. But for teachers to actually have games out in the classroom. I've heard from a lot of teachers that kids start playing chess, like kids they've never thought would play chess or playing chess. Have some games out. If you're able to, keep the playground open for a little while longer after school so kids have a place to go. We really have a lack of places for kids to hang out. So I just want to say, to think about it not just as creating the phone-free space, but what are you going to put into that space to make it even better?
We're almost out of time, so let me just take the last two briefly together.
You talked a lot about young people, caregivers, policy, and safety, and I'm interested in the point that you're bringing about how do we create the conditions for something like this. As a former school leader, I've witnessed the power dynamics between educators and young people, particularly young people of color. There's a very strong power dynamic where they're over-penalized for minor infractions such as a cell phone violation. So tell me a little bit about how you work with educators in particular to shift their mindsets around phone usage, because the old adage is, you can't use my phone, but I'm more important than you, so I get to use my phone. If my kid calls, it's okay. If my mom calls, it's okay. So how do you, in the implementation onboarding process, help districts, schools, and families shift the power dynamic that creates an unsafe psychological situation for young people in the classroom?
Okay, and the final one, please. Thanks, and we'll come back to
I'll be quick. My name's Dave. Great panel, great product, great book. I can't wait to read it. I would love my daughter's high school to be a phone-free school. My guess is they'd have questions about cost, and I don't know if they'd have money. Have you found foundations or other sources, like maybe just roughly, what does it cost for a school of $1,500? And are there some foundations or other sources they could look to for funding? Thank you.
Graham on the cost.
Sure, so we can follow up with the list of foundations and things around funding. We're happy to do that, and also can talk about the price of the program. It starts at $30 per student, and it's a purchase, and everything I talked about goes into that. So, but in terms of reaching out about foundations and funding, please do reach out to our team, and we'll get back to you with specifics. On the first question, just to touch on that, and then Meisha, I'll pass it to you. I would say, as part of the onboarding process, again, non-punitive approach is critical. It's not just that it's the right thing to do, it's what makes it work. So a lot of the districts we work with, they'll actually use the Velcro pouch we use for medical needs for students who have glucose monitoring or things like that. There's a pouch that looks like every other pouch, but it's a Velcro closure. A lot of schools decide to have teachers actually use that same pouch and demonstrate good phone etiquette inside the classroom because everyone's doing this together. So that's one thing we do. The other is in the upfront, I've heard this from a lot of teachers, especially and principals in New York City, is when they've instituted a phone-free policy and Yondr's involved, it kind of restructures the dynamic with students. Principals then come during the launch for the first week, 2 weeks, sometimes extends to 3 or 4, and they greet students as they come through the doorway. So it kind of restores that balance in the relationship and the direct contact with their students and the structure of the relationship around a new policy that you're rolling out. So I don't know if you want to add anything.
And to the second question first, we actually just had a conversation in the green room about doing a presentation and sharing information about where resources are, both federally, grants, and foundations. So look for that from the Yondr team. And I don't think anyone knows better than me as a former school leader in New York City in the boogie down Bronx about the importance of ensuring that we aren't creating policies that over-police children, period, right? Like, I want to say it plainly. And what, again, has attracted me to this conversation that we're having here and to Yondr as a company is it's never been about a punitive approach. It's really been about how do we create a powerful environment for learning. And that's why a lot of what you heard me say, I probably said it 17 times, are young people part of the conversations? Are their parents a part of the conversation? And I think the last thing I would say is, what problem are you actually trying to solve, right? By creating a phone-free space. And if the problem you're trying to solve is behavioral, then you're solving the wrong problem. If the problem you're trying to solve is about increasing learning time, increasing the joy of, ensuring that young people experience the joy of learning, ensuring that young people engage with each other, then that's a different thing. And so we, and I'm speaking for the company now, Graham, we don't want folks to pick Yondr to penalize communities, students, schools, and families. We want folks to choose Yondr as a program and a partner to create a phone-free space to increase learning opportunities for young people, period.
Okay, thanks. So now's the moment you can take out your phones.
Yes.
And, if you scan the code, you'll be able to, as you see, get a recording of the session for afterwards, as well as some additional resources. So I think a great panel. I think for me, for takeaways, one, we should think perhaps of tech as the new tobacco. Two, that kind of power and danger of phones in terms of actually instigating or accelerating violence and concern and panic. And then on the positive side, thinking about alternatives when we take away the phones and embracing that issue of the joy of missing out. So do please thank our panel.
You all have done they did a good job of not having their phones out.
I know.
We engaged.